Hi, thanks for coming, everyone. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are gathering on the unceded territory of the Lenape, who are the rightful stewards of this land known as New York City. So we're all here today to discuss something that I think is really critical in thinking about representation in the arts. At a time when AAPI artists are seemingly more visible than ever, it's important to think about how stakeholders in the art world can support and grow this momentum, so it's not just a one-and-done deal or something that happens as part of a trend. And while this discussion is specifically focused on AAPI artists, I believe this conversation will be applicable to minoritized communities broadly. My name is Shannon Lee, editor of the Asian American Arts Alliance's recently launched online magazine, The AMP. Our mission is to give voice to AAPI art and culture in New York City and beyond. With me is Lisa Gold, director of Asian American Arts Alliance, aka A4, and I'll let Lisa do the broad intro for A4. We also have Sadaf Padder, correct me if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, founder of Alpha Arts Alliance, which is a Brooklyn-based art dealership and agency focusing on South Asian and Caribbean women artists. And we also have Jon Santos, artist and founder of the site-specific performance collaborative Ontopo, who currently is exhibiting the work of Ben Alan here at NADA. So thank you all for coming. I wanted to begin our conversation with our slideshow, which, if you see, I guess it's not playing right now, but we've all selected 5 or 6 of our favorite AAPI artists. So it would be great if, as we're introducing ourselves and our work, if we could also select one of the artists that we've chosen for our slides and just talk about why they're meaningful. I chose Carlos Villa, who is a Filipino-American artist who is only recently starting to get critical recognition. He currently has a great booth with Silver Lens Gallery over at Frieze. He had a fantastic show at Newark Museum of Art and over in San Francisco last year. And he is really kind of, I don't want to say the first, but one of the first Filipino-American artists to get institutional recognition, and his work really delves deep into exploring Asian American identity when he didn't have the resources and didn't have the education that would allow him to explore that identity. It was a time before Asian American studies existed, so he really, I think, helped pioneer what that could mean as an artist. With that, I'll pass it on to Lisa, and if you want to scroll.
Okay, this way, right, okay.
I think it's the down key, actually.
Down key?
Yeah.
Nope, that's not me.
Oh
That's
yeah,
okay.
you could keep scrolling through.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let me, I guess I'll introduce myself first.
Sure.
I'm Lisa Gold, Executive Director of the Asian American Arts Alliance, and we are a 40-year-old service organization that works to support Asian American artists and arts organizations across all disciplines. And our mission is to ensure greater representation, equity, and opportunities, and we do that through promotion, like the AMP and our monthly calendar. We do it through direct funding, through fellowships like our Bandung residency to promote Black Asian solidarity. We have some Van Leer fellowships, Jaden Wong Fellowship in Dance. And we do it through professional development workshops and connections. So we have a range of workshops. Since we work with artists of all kinds, we have workshops on how to nail an audition that we just did with Disney Musical Theater, but we also have programs like our Van Leer Fellowship, where we'll hook an artist up with an artistic mentor and a business kind of career coach. So Maya Chow was one of our recent visual arts fellows, and her artistic mentor was Nina Kachadorian. So we were able to facilitate that. And then Nina invited Maya to be her guest at the Hirshhorn, like artists honoring artists. So it turns into this great network and opportunity for artists to connect. So that's one of the things that we do. I picked Zheching Shea because I love obsessive artists. And I was just amazed by the commitment to this project. He was a performance durational artist who created 4 pieces. One of them was to punch a clock every hour on the hour for a year. One was to never go outside. One was to be chained to his partner. And I think the other one, they were like in a cage together for a year. And then never to make art again. And I just love that so much. Again, I think he's the seminal figure in conceptual art, and I just think he's amazing. So.
Thanks. Well said. I'll take the clicker.
Oh, okay.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sadaf Padder. I'm the founder of Alpha Arts Alliance, which is a hyper-local collective, and I would say creative coaching service for artists. So not exclusive to a diaspora, but do tend to focus on women coming from the Asian and Caribbean diasporas. I function as an independent curator, advisor, and writer. And the artists that I have selected, I think here's a few. I'll talk about Ariana Manai, who is an Iranian artist, and she's currently exhibiting in a show I have open in Brooklyn. She's informed by Persian architecture and aesthetics, and is actually having her friend send items from Iran that she's using to emboss into the paper. Her family also owns a wheat factory in Iran. So I found her work really resonant with my own experience. My family is Kashmiri from military-occupied Kashmir, the most militarized region in the world. So we found a lot of resonance just in speaking about the protests this year in Iran, which were women-led, and what does it mean to be someone who is of the diaspora in another country and find connection, and how do we kind of, what role can we play through the arts in connecting with our homelands?
Hi, thank you. My name is Jon Santos. I'm the principal of Common Space Design, which is a graphic design studio. And one of the projects that we initiated as a kind of as a kind of side project is called Ontopo, which is a project where I've been bringing artists to a Korean Buddhist temple in upstate New York called Baklimsa. And after hosting about those experiences for about 4 to 5 years, I ended up living in Hawaii before the lockdown. I ended up staying there, and I met this really amazing artist named Nanea Lum. And what I learned in the time that I spent in Hawaii is that they have a really deep understanding and respect for the environment, in particular the watershed, or the ahupo'a. And I had reflected back on my project, and I thought about how this Buddhist temple that we had been spending time was at the top of a watershed. And the ceremonial observation and respect of the flow of the water from the top of the mountain to the ocean unlocks all these different ways to think about how we treat each other and how we treat the land. And so I've kind of begun this reverse process of trying to unpack that knowledge. And so since the lockdown, I thought it would be a good gesture of me to bring this artwork to New York City. And so last year I brought Sean Connolly and Nanea to NADA in New York and Miami. And this year I'm working with Ben Allen, who's a little bit closer to sort of like my cultural identity. He's Filipino born, making work that traces Filipino weaving traditions. And so, so that's kind of where I'm at with this. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Actually, Emily, is it possible for us to have the slideshow just kind of scrolling throughout, or? Okay. Cool. Thank you so much. Thanks, y'all. I also wanted to ask a personal question. I would love to know when the first time, if ever, you felt an artwork really represented you as AAPI. Lisa, do you want to take this?
I am going to say, sadly, never. I don't know that I've ever seen a work that is me, that makes me feel like me. I'm Hapa. I'm half Korean, half white. My family lives in Hawaii. There's not a lot of work out there that speaks to me on that personal level.
I'm going to echo that, but also then give an example of the closest I've felt. So my family is Kashmiri. There's about 15,000 of us in the U.S., and Ahmadi Muslim, which is a persecuted sect. There's about 5,000 of us in the U.S., which means that me and my sisters are the only other Kashmiri Ahmadi Muslims I've ever met in the U.S. However, when I saw Basira Khan's work at Pioneer Works a few years ago, as someone who is South Asian, Muslim, queer, femme, and just seeing the scarves and thinking about my own mother and Parda, having grown up very conservatively and Muslim, and Basira kind of being like a rebel, a badass in that way, I definitely connected with that.
So it's a complicated question for me because I've been a participant in many artistic communities, and the first time I remember acknowledging my Filipino-ness was in San Francisco in the Bay Area when I encountered a DJ crew called the Invisible Scratch Pickles. And what was really interesting...
What were they called?
The Invisible Scratch Pickles. And they, in the art form of hip-hop, they're like innovators of scratching as an art form. Wow. But they were actually forwardly known as Filipino. And I remember growing up in Michigan thinking, wow, you can actually be recognized for being Filipino. It was actually a really striking moment. But obviously that's not really connected, I think, to the world that we're in now. I had two other situations. One was with Rene de Guzman, who's a Filipino curator at the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts. He curated me into a survey show, like a biennial show in San Francisco, but then moving to New York, Nancy Bolalacao, who started the Filipino American Museum, I feel like there are these cycles of visibility, but Nancy really, with the creation of the Filipino American Museum, really reminded me that, oh, you can be Filipino like that. Does that matter? And I'm constantly questioning that. Obviously, the difference being, is Filipino-ness represented in the form, or is being Filipino enough? And Nancy told me this morning, she's like, just being Filipino is enough. It comes out in the work, so.
Yeah, it's like that everlasting question of, what makes your identity, what makes a work Asian American? Does it have to be explicitly about your Asian Americanness, your diaspora-ness, or does it just come through regardless? But yeah, thank you all. I love how deeply sincere all of those answers were. So I think, and feel free to disagree, but to me, especially during APA Heritage Month, it feels like this year in particular, we're seeing just a wellspring of Asian American representation in art and in culture. And I don't think this was always the case. Even a year ago, I don't think I felt it as strongly. And from your perspectives, being from different sectors in the art industry, I would love to know your perspectives on what the factors were that made this possible in the art industry. What do you think has changed? We could go down the line, but if also anyone feels specifically passionate, feel free to jump in.
I mean, I immediately think about Margaret Lee, who is an artist who started 47 Canal, who, in my early years in New York, she was working for Cindy Sherman, and I never really thought about how powerful those kinds of connections were. And she leveraged her art world relationships and shared those relationships with emerging artists. And to me, I think I'm working now in the imprint of that. I'm taking whatever capital I have to give visibility, and I don't have very much, but I think, I think that curators, like some of the examples I gave before, that curators bringing in artists, bringing visibility to artists, I think was a key game changer for all of that. And I think it's important for me to say that, I worked on this social justice, I guess, collective called Stop Discrimination that was born out of the pandemic. And most of the founding members of this collective were art industry people. They were top curators at institutions and museums in the country. And I firsthand saw how that these people have power to actually start careers. And And I think there's an unspoken sort of like responsibility amongst people in the community, even though I think there's trouble even articulating this idea of like being Asian American.
Sure.
I want to echo Jon's comments because I do believe that with more people of color in gatekeeper positions, primarily curatorial, it makes a huge difference. I think about Melissa Chu. When I was at the Hirshhorn, her first show was Shireen Nishat. So, that makes a difference, having people, like you said, bringing people along, opening the door, making those connections.
Definitely people moving into the positions, and I think also folks who are moving into positions that are analyzing data and who are then sharing that in media, because it's holding some of these institutions more accountable than ever before. So I think of, even though they're not Asian run, I think of the Burns-Halperin report as a really great example of this, where we can really get past the optics of how much progress does it look like we've made versus how much we've had actually made.
Yeah, absolutely. Just breaking down the numbers. How is this actually affecting communities and audiences? Yeah. Kind of piggybacking off of that, and this might be a little bit of a heated question, but since we're talking about the art industry and the art market, do you find that it's important for AAPI representation to be present in the art market? What does that mean? What does that imply? If anyone wants to take that one.
So I think this is a very sensitive area that I've entered, being someone who is standing in a booth at an art fair, not only representing Filipino American work, but Hawaiian work, which is very different positionality. And, personally, sometimes I feel like I wonder, and this might be the insecurity of being Filipino American, sometimes I wonder, I'm like, is it value? Is it worth it? Like, am I showing this work that I'm trying to sell for $9,000? Like, do they perceive the value? So for me personally, standing in a booth at an art fair, it's kind of nerve-wracking because I'm falling into some of my own insecurities, but also that like it's a pretty, it's unsettling. It's a very unsettling place to be in this position of like commodifying a culture, and so I think that's highly problematic. And for me, it's if I break even, that's great. But ultimately, this for me has only been a mission to give visibility to these artists in a position where they're next to people who are actually, considered valid, artists who are going to sell in the market. So I'm very new in this position, and I hope that I'm perceiving things in the right way. I mean, it's hard to really understand, right?
Sure. Yeah. Like being in a minoritized community, I think, it is a double-edged sword to have to evaluate artists. And, when you're working within these larger institutions who aren't necessarily catered to AAPI art, AAPI artists, how much of your vision do you sacrifice? Is the work going to be understood, or is like it more important for the work just to be in the collection? I don't know if did y'all want to also expound on that?
I mean, representation is absolutely important, but I think thinking of how does that then lead to the canonization of an artist. So when we're looking at acquisitions, whether that's institutionally or at a university level, but also at scholarship, I think that really looking at how our artists are being written about and using that as a way to then go back through archives and reshape the stories that have been told. I'm finding a really fascinating surge of artists who are using archival material and historical records to retell stories that have long been told by those outside of our communities.
Absolutely.
I agree. That's why we started the AMP, because we need to document, we need to create our own archives and to elevate those voices, to give a platform not just to the artists, but to the critics as well, so they can share the work through a culturally sensitive, appropriate, knowledgeable lens.
Yeah, absolutely. And to the point of kind of like canonizing and creating this archive, New York State, I think we just we passed REACH, right? Or it's in the process of? Yeah. So we just passed legislation that would make AAPI history part of New York City curriculum, which is major. Wow. You know, like, at least for me growing up in New York, we never had that. And, you know, not even from like an art historical perspective, but just from a broad historical perspective, what it means to like know what your possibilities are growing up. And, you know, in art history, as more critical writing is, and scholarship is being amassed about these artists and about these works, and we're creating this archive and we're building and we're putting value on this work. I think, you know, passing that forward 2 generations is what's going to create that sustained momentum. So this was actually very quick, but how are we doing on time? Doing great? Okay, cool. This is actually my last question, but if there was anything else y'all wanted to discuss, I would love to know from each of your industry perspectives what you would like to see more of from the art industry that you would feel would help generate a sustained market for AAPI art and artists.
I'm gonna say resources. Yeah. You know, we are a service organization. We exist to support artists, and art and artists don't exist in a vacuum. They need a community. They need support. They need funding, space to live. You know, people to share ideas, critical feedback, all of that. And until that is equitable, we still have a lot of work to do, I think.
I think it would help to have like a cohort. Oh my gosh, as Heather walks in. It would help to have a cohort that teaches like new art dealers how to price artwork and how to like positioning. And I know that there is kind of like if you talk to your friends who are art dealers, you can get kind of a standard or they can give you the lowdown. But I thought it would help to have like a cohort, which is maybe a project that I will lead on my own for the New Art Dealers Alliance in 2024. But like, so it would be nice if, for example, like galleries who have this kind of focus could get advice from more experienced gallerists on how to price things and how to do sales. And I've been kind of winging it and getting advice from friends. But I think that would certainly help.
That's all anything is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I always love to see like critical and uncomfortable conversations to hold people accountable. We want to see more of that. And I will say that that's played a big part in how I've been able to get my foot in the door when there's been articles written that are talking about Asian artists, but there's not one brown artist on there. That's how I got my first editorial with Artsy. You know, I formed direct relationship with that team. But also being able to recognize like when we can use those things to our advantage and then branch out. I'm very cognizant of not wanting to be boxed in of I'm a South Asian curator who works with South Asian artists, because if you know me, my entry point in the community goes much deeper than that. So I would like to see more curations that are intentional about the connective themes and that are looking at these cross-diaspora connections. That's a big part of why I do the work in the Caribbean and in Haiti as well. And I also have been thinking a lot about the role of a patron. Like, what does patronage look like beyond just collecting someone's art? So when an artist is at a critical point in their career, what does it look like to sustain them, give them studio materials, introduce them to people who might be able to provide that? So patronage looking much wider and deeper than just buying the art to put in your home.
Yeah, I think that's a huge topic of conversation is kind of reframing what a collector and the role of a collector could be, and also, are there more supportive models that don't allow for so much, say, like art flipping, or that don't promote this sort of like vampiric relationship between an artist and their patron? I think especially when it comes to minoritized artists, I think that can be like a very big issue. Especially as like diasporic artists are becoming, like, I hate to say it, but in vogue with a lot of collectors. I wonder if any of y'all within your areas of expertise have come across models that help kind of like curb that, or things that you're thinking about in terms of how we can like reframe that model?
I have a supportive model that I want to share. It's not the collector patron model, but it is a supportive model. There was an organization in Washington, D.C. called Washington Project for the Art, and they did a mother's art studio where they provided daycare for mother artists. So in the studio space, they would have 4 hours of uninterrupted studio time, which as a new mother, I'm sure you all know, is like nearly impossible. And for a month and a half, they had this studio space. And there aren't a lot of models like that. So thinking about artists and Asian American artists, the intersectionality and the whole of people and trying to help them on all of those levels is really important.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I think on that, just to dovetail off that, I think I'm reflecting now at these times when there was a lot of unity amongst all Asians, and they're usually during some kind of like crisis.
Yes.
And it's a little disheartening to think that when things are seemingly normal, the unity is gone. And so I think there should be some kind of regularity to the cohort structure, which is like I hate to say it, but like a Zoom call therapy session, which in 2020, it brought a lot of like healing to people, and especially in the Stop Discrimination group. But then it just goes all away when like everything is seemingly normal. But so some kind of consistent cohort, but not necessarily learning about artling, a cohort that's just about being.
Yeah.
I think the Asianish group is still going, so.
Okay, I'd like to know about more.
I mean, I think I have a few thoughts ping-ponging around up there.
Sure.
I'm observing collector collectives, folks who are coming
yes.
together to purchase work together, and then also then hosting and educating their peers about artists. On that flip end, I'm also observing a trend of collectors who are quickly wanting to become dealers, and I think that's a dangerous trend and something that I've been very cognizant of. But I've also, you say like we've observed solidarity, and I think about that, and I'm not sure I've felt or observed it to the same degree in at least the South Asian diaspora. And I think that is one, because our language is so homogenizing. When we talk about Asian and Asian American,
Right.
people default to thinking about a few things. Yes. And when they talk about South Asian, they default to thinking about North Indian, high caste, Hindu. And so the diaspora is so much wider than that. And I think curation is going to allow us to really share that, but it's also going to be up to us to start to be more deliberate and intentional about the language we're using. And as much as we can, I really advocate for being regionally specific about the language we're using, and starting to think of like what terms can we perhaps propose that might go against the terms that were given unto us by the government.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Like I think the trap with a lot of, I think the trap that a lot of people fall into when thinking about AAPI identity, to your point, Sadaf, is they default to like, oh, it's East Asian.
You go to UK, they think.
Exactly. Yes. And are there ways to kind of unpack that and break those things down? And Jon, to your point, I love the idea of consistent cohort. I also think those forums are great just as a communication tool, and to have these ongoing conversations about identity, what it means, what are the pressing issues, what are the things that we need, resource sharing. So yeah, I think that's excellent. Cool. I would love to open it up to the floor for questions, if there are any. Don't be shy. Yeah. Do you want? Okay, cool.
I can speak loud enough. So
Sweet.
I'm an artist. My family's from Pakistan. Some of the issues that I've run into in showing is kind of, the value of art, at least, in my community, my parents, friends, is not probably as recognized as it is in other communities, right? So I wanted to get the panel's thoughts on, like, kind of targeting, Asian communities and saying, don't go to Home Goods. Don't buy something that has no relevance to your culture. right? Something that you can relate to. So I wanted to get the panel's thoughts on that.
So, go ahead.
No, please.
I think when you recognize the absence, it almost becomes your duty to bring a presence, and I feel like that's a model that I've witnessed for my entire life. And so I encourage you to maybe see what resources you have to actually create this place for representation that is not there.
I mean, I think, what's that? We're looking at a specific issue here too. Like if we look in New York, I have not met I know one other South Asian female dealer, right? And there's not one South Asian female-owned commercial space. We have 3 South Asian male-run spaces. But I think that there's education that needs to happen, and I'm discussing this with a few other dealers and institutions of what that looks like. But there's folks who want to, they don't know where to start. Yeah. And now when they do start, what we also have seen over the last few years is a real price inflation. And so when people do want to start collecting, I think that they kind of feel boxed out. So I think that there's some coaching and education that needs to happen for folks so they start to understand what it looks like and means to collect. But yes, how do we make it feel relevant and important is something I'm wrestling with all the time, because most of the collectors I've worked with thus far as an advisor have been those who identify as Black art collectors. And now they're wanting to open up and diversify. It's only in the last year that I'm working with Asian art collectors. And so that's taken me years, for them to even find me. So
I think it's important to note that the world of contemporary art is like this global kind of hegemonic. It almost doesn't want to recognize identity in some ways, And I think what I'm doing with Ben this year is kind of an experiment because, actually, I mean, when I brought Nanea from Hawaii last year, it just, in my mind, if the art is really good, people are going to buy it. So the art fair is it's a very literal, non-critical space. And I've only this is my 3rd time doing this, but what I intuit is that the art has to be really good. And that's going to drive the sale, if you're talking about commercial work. And then the backstory of this is their cultural practices, and this is the connection to their country of origin. I actually wonder still how much that actually drives the sale. Because in the end, it just has to. Someone has to really emotionally connect to it. And I'm in the middle of this experiment with Ben Allen in my booth. It's very Filipino art, and I'm looking around. I'm like, I don't know. There's not much other cultural art going on, and it doesn't seem like contemporary art really. It's contemporary art's almost like its own international language.
Yeah, I think I would also add, I think the thing you're identifying too is I think a broader cultural habit of people feeling very gate-kept from actual art, not home goods art. And, it's how do you bridge that? How do you break down that barrier to entry? How do you make art accessible to people as this work of art is something you could own, and it's not something that's exclusively for the ultra wealthy. If this is meaningful to you, then you should invest in it as, a part of you. So I think education and accessibility and creating that shift in culture and how we value art. But yeah, great question. Anyone else?
I'm just wondering about Asian American grant systems.
Mm.
And, we're talking about, your point, John, about feeling like you're in an awkward position depending on who your clientele, your possible clientele could be. How many steps, at what point does it become less integrated into Asian American
I'm just, okay. So,
That's your wheelhouse, yeah.
So there's this organization called Asian American Pacific Islanders in Philanthropy, and they did a study. And they found this isn't even arts funding. This is all funding from foundations to AAPI-led and serving organizations. For every $100 that a foundation gives, 2 cents of that goes to AAPI-led and serving organizations. So that gives you an insight into the magnitude of the disparity and the problems. Even within New York City, AAPIs make up about 18% of the city population. Through the Department of Cultural Affairs, the largest cultural budget in the nation, bigger than the NEA, AAPI artists and art-serving organizations get about 1% of that. Yeah, there you go, the data. And that's what gets people to listen. So I testify all the time. I'm testifying next week at the budget hearing. And citing these figures is what got the past commissioner's attention and is paying attention to our community because it was a blind spot for him. So it is a problem, and I meet with foundations and funders and people all the time so that they're aware because, knowledge, visibility is the first step of, recognizing the issue and correcting it.
I think, the complexity of being Asian is the adjacency that Asian people have in industry, right? So when we were organizing Stop Discrimination, I was looking around and I was like, these people are running they're directors of curators at major institutions. And out of that, there was an organization called Gyopo that was born in Los Angeles. And, there's a lot of private money that's going into that. And it's really meant to support Korean American artists, and I think we might see more of that in the future where there are these very specific monies set aside for people with a particular cultural background. I'm looking for the Filipino one. I'm looking for Augusto. No, I was kidding. Help us, Augusto. No, he was here, but it's a great question. And I would like to get more information from you after about these organizations.
I'm curious to know, Jon, do you feel like that kind of specificization and that kind of, what do you call it? Getting more specific about specific AAPI identities within funding systems, do you think that's helpful? How do you feel about decollectivizing?
I mean, it's really a hard question, but I don't know.
Yeah.
I guess also because we're being videotaped, I'm I don't know what to say.
From on record, yeah. No, that's totally fair. That's I wouldn't know how to answer that. So
I think because I'm still in the middle of this experiment of expressing my Filipino-ness as a part of my practice. And it was only this morning when Nancy from FAM told me, she's like, everything you do, it has Filipino-ness in it. And I was shocked. I was like, what? What do you mean? But I thought about it, and the way I saw Gyopo come together, it's because the people who are funding it, they are very aware of art. And this is not common, right? And anytime I find out there's Filipino people in art, that it becomes even more special that you're even in art. And these dinners, we started organizing these dinners with some Filipino artists and art world people. And I remember Margaret Lee and some of our Korean friends finding out about it. They're like, how come we're not invited? I'm like, because you're Korean. You have Koreatown.
yes, totally.
and so, it might be that, it's so interesting to meet the people from Silverlands and see that there's starting to be this conversation, because I never really imagined this growing up, that this could ever be a thing. But I can see that, I would expect that Filipinos who can afford to support the community will somehow. And maybe somehow I will figure out how to start that.
Yeah.
I don't know. I just came up with that idea just now.
It's a little nebula for ideas. I love it. Yes.
I think now the commercial networks, looks like there's more in various blocks, maybe not
example. Maybe not for commercial gallery, but I was looking at ICA Los Angeles accepts guest curatorial proposals, but you need to come in with your own funding. So that's something automatically I was like, well, shoot, who do I go to? There's individuals that, folks, collectors I know who would be ready to gift work to a museum, but I don't know if I have that same network in terms of, hey, would you be willing to provide the production budget for this artist? So that's something I'm thinking of, like what foundations or nonprofits are there. So artists, I'm a big fan of artists also producing their own shows, right, outside of spaces. So it goes back to the idea of patronage as well. But yeah, a little tangential to your question, but.
I don't know. I was just going to say we don't have a lot of partnerships per se with commercial galleries, but we do support the work. Like there's a review of the Maya Ruth Lee show, Tina Kim, in the most recent issue of the AMP. We do professional development training for our artists and arts workers. So we had a kind of career roundtable, and we had someone from a gallery and a curator from a nonprofit, and we had people from an auction house and different positions in the art world providing insight, again, as these kind of gatekeepers and providing networking and career building opportunities. So that's one way, or two ways, I guess, that we find ways to partner.
Yeah, and I think, I don't know how much of this is known to emerging artists, but if you're an artist that gets like an institutional show, there's a lot of fundraising that needs to happen, and it typically happens with your dealer. If your dealer has connections and the ability to fundraise, that's a real game changer. So, whether or not that can be honed to become something where it's based on like your cultural identity, I would hope that maybe something like that would happen. I'm wondering if your organization, if you would also work with artists to like execute a work that's out of their reach, with funding.
Yeah, we don't give out funds that way. It's we just recently started returning to direct funds to artists. We went through a pretty tough financial period ourselves. But as we look to, we recognize the importance that there are so few grant opportunities expressly dedicated to AAPI artists of any discipline. And I think we have the only dance curatorial fellowship. I know Gold House has one big prize award for an artist, but that's a pretty successful artist, and there just aren't that many opportunities. And so by bringing that attention to foundations and creating that opportunity, like we're trying to, we're actually submitting an application tomorrow for a grant to support artists in that way, yeah. And actually, I shouldn't say that, like with the Van Leer Fellowship, we do help an artist. We had a Filipino dance artist who created a piece based on her heritage, and provided her $6,000 in direct funds for that. She could use it for however she wants. And we had another artist filmmaker, and he used it to produce his film. Right. So we do help in those ways, yeah. Wish we had more.
Yes. Oh, sorry. I think you had a question, and then we can get you after. Yeah.
Just wondering about for AAPI related stuff as a whole, is there representation of for instance, I went to visit some Biennale exhibitions in Bangkok this last winter for us, and it was cool to see Thai artists and internationally renowned artists. But this idea of AAPI being an American thing, is there representation outside of our borders of people in, let's just say, a place like Saigon or Hanoi, a place like Bangkok, and these hubs for potential art shows and exhibitions and biennales? Is there representation from this bubble?
I think it was interesting. Yeah,
Ian
I
Chang
think
and Josh Klein.
totally.
Yeah, I see that part of that.
Yeah. It's also interesting too. I was in Korea this past fall, and it was really fascinating to see how many institutions were really interested in Asian American and Korean American artists, where they were we're all about the Korean diaspora. I think Korea in particular has a very interesting history with that because of how many Korean diasporic people there are because of the history with war, et cetera. But yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I get the feeling that with how like decentralized art is becoming with the internet and Instagram and all of that, I think I wouldn't be surprised if that's happening globally, if people are connecting more and more with diaspora, and I think yeah, I'm sure we're seeing like the specificities of Asian Americanness being represented in like home countries broadly.
Like, right now, I feel like maybe it's just I'm surrounded by people that are a little in the know, and like the conversation's like, wow, like an Asian art is blowing up.
Yeah.
Not necessarily like Asian American, but like
Asia.
Asia.
Somewhere in Asia, like a Chinese artist, Korean artist.
Yeah.
And you'll see it reflected in the auction results right now too.
Yes.
We are seeing that.
Yeah. Yeah, and also thinking about emerging markets too. You know, the second, or I think it's like the third largest art market now is China, which makes a lot of sense. But I know like secondary markets, primary markets are really focusing on Asia. You know, Frieze is in Seoul now, and how is that also going to affect, like the Asian American art market and artists and the conversations we're having? So, yeah, I think it's definitely an interesting time to be creating work. Yeah. Did anyone want to?
One more question?
Yeah. I think we had another question.
Yes, I really enjoyed listening to all of you today. Kind of on the topic of the question you asked about specifics, or like how do you feel about, let's say, funding going towards a Korean American group? I'm Vietnamese, and I think lots of Southeast Asia, oftentimes I never see art shows. I think I've been to a lot in the past 2 weeks, and when I look at the names, I do see Asians, mostly from East Asia. And so I'm kind of curious, like, if you were wanting to go source art like that, where would you go? Where, I've done the internet.
You mean art made by?
Yeah, like I've looked, even when I tried to source like antiques from Vietnam, a lot of them are in France now. And when you go to the auction, that's the best way to buy Vietnamese antiques. Is actually in France. Very hard to another country, Vietnam, for example.
Wow.
So I'm very curious what your thoughts are, like Asian Americans. It's kind of just a microcosm, I think, of also wealth and equity sometimes amongst the groups.
Yes.
Would you be conducting this Google search from the United States or from outside of the United States? Like, are you asking like inside the United States?
Yeah, inside the United States. Like, where would one look to find, artists that, even in emerging art fairs, I just don't see the last names right there representing.
Yeah.
And you're speaking like you have yet to find specifically artists like who are Vietnamese.
Yes.
She wants like an index, which is really interesting, right? It's really.
Totally. Yes. I think I used to work at Artsy, and they have a pretty thorough database of artists, and their search function is pretty good, where I think, it's not like enormously specific, but they're all about like, what's it called? Most of Artsy is coders. So their ability to kind of like segment artists is really good. They have this thing called the Genome, so each artist has their own kind of like DNA. So you can kind of look up keywords that are associated with specific artists. Like you could look up Vietnamese American artist and you might come up with results. That's from my own personal bank of knowledge. But yeah, I know it is a struggle because, Asia's massive.
So you've inspired me to ask ChatGPT to compile a list of Asian artists in the United States and categorize them by country, parental, ancestral country of origin in ascending alphabetical order.
There you go. Let the algorithm work for you. Let's see how true it is. Yeah.
I mean, actually, if you made that list, it would be incredible, right? If there was that list.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it makes me wonder. Yeah.
Complicated.
There you go.
The question is like, what about
Still
halfies? Because you know, my friend texted me, Josh Klein is being claimed by AAPI. I was like, what? I dropped my phone. I mean, I think of him as being Filipino.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, because a lot of Filipinos have a mixed vibe or something, right?
Sure. Yeah, there's that.
No. What bucket would you go in?
Yeah.
Right.
My own bucket.
Right. Okay. So you'd have to ask ChatGPT to put them in their own list.
Yeah, and that to that point, it's like, yeah, how are you segmenting yourself? You know, and like that's like a whole other conversation about identity, and like especially for like historical AAPI artists, like say Carlos Villa or like Bernice Bing, like would they in their like artsy.net like genome typing in, would they categorize themselves as like Filipino American artist or Chinese American artist, or you know, so when you're doing this more like institutional work, like yeah, how do you honor those identities, both in the past and in the future? Yeah, when they are really amorphous and they're personal, they're so specific to who you are. So it's never gonna be a catch-all, and you're never gonna get everyone, and that's, I think, kind of the point. But yeah, I think, yeah, there's still a lot of work to be done, but a database would still be very helpful. Cool. Are there any more questions? No? All right. I think we're all set. Thank you all so much for coming. Yeah, feel free to stick around and chat.